All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started so we have time for as many questions as we can today. My name is Troy Fosheim. I work here at SciLine, here at AAAS, where we connect journalists with scientists in order to facilitate evidence-based, scientifically accurate news reporting. At SciLine, we've facilitated close to 3,000 interactions between scientists and journalists, and we've learned a lot in that process. Specifically, in talking with the people on both sides of that equation, we've heard a lot about the positives and pain points of these interactions. We find that a lot of those pain points arise because of misunderstandings of the other group's needs, workflows, and culture. So with that in mind, we offer an introductory course on how science works to journalists. And today, I hope to be able to introduce you to a little bit more about how the media works, give you the information that you need to work more smoothly with journalists, and hopefully help you feel more confident in that process. After this presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with 3 journalists working in the human rights space, moderated by SciLine's director and former Washington Post science reporter, Rick Weiss. During the panel, you'll have the opportunity to ask all of your questions about journalism and journalists directly to the people who are steeped in it every day. But first, I want to start by setting the stage with an overview of the media landscape. Over the last 10 or 15 years, the media landscape in the US has changed pretty significantly. In 2008, the US had about 114,000 newsroom employees across newspaper, radio, TV, cable, and digital outlets. By 2020, that number had dropped to 85,000, so a loss of 26%. There are a number of contributing factors here, but a big one is the revenue loss in the shift from print to digital platforms. And looking deeper, this bar chart shows the percentage of total newsroom employees by industry at 3 points in time. You have 2008 on the left, 2014 in the middle, and 2020 on the right. Overall, in that 12-year span, newsroom employment has plummeted at US newspapers, which is shown in dark maroon at the bottom of each bar, and it has increased in the digital publishing sector, which is that tan part at the top of each bar. Newspapers once employed 62% of all news professionals in 2008, but now only account for 36% of staff in the news sector. Broadcast TV, meanwhile, has increased its share of news employees, but in raw numbers, their employment hasn't changed significantly. Simply by maintaining their employment level while others fell, TV news now reflects a larger fraction of the total employment these days. But as anyone who has complained about the past few years will tell you, there is certainly not less news to report, nor is news happening more slowly. Instead, a lot of outlets just have fewer reporters trying to cover the same amount of news just as quickly as a staff twice the size could. Why that matters to science news in particular is that specialized reporters with a background in science or science reporting were among the first layoffs in this trend of decreasing newsrooms, which means that a lot of science news, when it's being reported at all, is being reported by general assignment reporters. These are reporters without any particular specialty, but who report on anything they're assigned, from crime to human interest to politics to breaking news. And they are often truly excellent journalists. But at the same time, they may not have a deep background in science, an understanding of the nuances of how science works, or a broad network of experts that they can turn to for context. And this means that by speaking to the media, you can have a really powerful impact. Because a lot of these journalists don't necessarily have that background in understanding the scientific process or the familiarity with the broader context of specific scientific questions, they need experts like you to help provide that. And speaking to the media does make a difference. In 2021, Pew released new survey data on what Americans look for to decide whether a news story is trustworthy. Here, you can see the percentage of respondents in that survey who said it was very important to consider qualities like the organization that published it, their gut instinct about the story, the person who shared it with them, the specific journalist who reported it, and importantly for our purposes, the sources cited in it. That same survey showed variations in those responses by political affiliation, but overall, more than 20% of those surveyed say they pay very close attention to the sources in a story, and another 45% said they pay somewhat close attention when deciding whether or not a story is trustworthy. So it's not just your ability to explain complex or nuanced issues that can make a difference. As a source in that story, readers and viewers are paying attention to the fact that you were even involved in the first place. By talking to a reporter, you bring your credibility as a scientist to boost the credibility of any given story. And remember that the vast majority of the time, you and the reporter are on the same side. You both want to produce the most accurate story with the best scientific information. And scientists and journalists actually have a lot in common in pursuit of that goal. Curiosity drives a lot of what reporters choose to cover, in a similar way that it drives the research that you may choose to pursue. Both scientists and journalists are measured by what they publish. Publish or perish is, of course, the old rule in academia, and that's true for reporters as well. And both want to be first. No one wants to be scooped, not on a discovery in the lab or on a big story. But that doesn't mean there's 100% overlap in your goals. And some of the differences are things that you should keep in mind as you prepare and practice for an interview. Journalists publish on dramatically different timescales from researchers. Especially in the era of digital news, people are refreshing the Washington Post homepage several times a day, expecting new content. An individual reporter may be having to publish daily or even multiple times a day to keep up with our news consumption. So if you get a call and a reporter says they need to talk in the next few hours, they're usually being honest about that. And there's also another one on this list is that there is a lot of nuance in science that can't and shouldn't be captured in a news story. I know when I was still doing research, I thought my particular topic was fascinating and that everyone else would also find all the tiny details fascinating. And that to understand this detail, you had to understand this other detail, and to understand that, you had to, and it would just spiral out from there. So you want to ask yourself how incomplete and straightforward you can be without being inaccurate. That balance between accuracy and simplicity can be a really tough line to walk, but it's so important. And getting it right will make you an invaluable source to a reporter. One other that I want to highlight from this list is the idea of preparedness versus unscripted moments. Most science communication trainers, including me, will tell you that you should prepare 2 to 3 main points that you want to make in an interview. And you should most definitely practice what you want to say. But journalists aim to get a source to let their guard down and be more unscripted. They'll actively strive to put you more at ease, to make it feel like you're talking with a friend in order to capture something that doesn't sound rehearsed. Maybe they're hoping for an anecdote or some insight into your emotional response to a discovery or how you feel about a bigger issue in the field. This isn't a bad thing at all, but you should be aware of it and be conscious of how you respond. If you do decide to discuss something that you hadn't originally planned for, make sure it's because you decide to and not because you find yourself rambling a bit. Think about how you personally can come across as authentic without going totally rogue. That authenticity will make you more relatable, likable, and perhaps even usable as a source. Another skill that will make you more usable as a source is tailoring your message to your audience. Because audiences differ, their needs differ, and you shouldn't go into every interview with the exact same talking points. You need to consider the audience's interest level in the topic, their baseline knowledge of the subject, the amount of time they'll devote to digesting your message, and in what ways your message is relevant to their everyday lives. The type of news outlet can also help you figure out how to tailor your message and the way that you present it. So first, you have national publications, things like the New York Times, NPR, Fox News, that have very broad audiences and scope. These are often some of the better funded newsrooms and are more likely to have a dedicated science reporter, health, or environment reporter. And they may even specifically have a science section. Because their audience is national, these outlets are often looking to report on generalizable knowledge. They're looking for something that a large portion of the country might find interesting and useful. In contrast, local news focuses on local issues and applications and news that you can use. These are the newspaper, radio, and television stations that focus on reporting about local people, places, and issues within a defined geographic area. So outlets like the Cape Cod Times in Massachusetts or KCUR Public Radio in Kansas City. Local outlets have been among the hardest hit by layoffs and funding cuts over the last decade, with some local news outlets, particularly local newspapers, closing altogether. So while science, health, and environment reporting does happen at these outlets, maybe it's a story about research being done at a local university, or the potential outcomes of a policy, or the implications of a local disease outbreak, it may not be being handled by a science reporter, but by one of those general assignment reporters I mentioned. So the sources that these reporters talk to are particularly important for providing context and information that the reporter needs to frame the story. They may also really want to know not just about the science itself, but how it might be directly relevant in their community. Finally, you have specialty outlets, things like National Geographic, Popular Science, Scientific American. These publications focus on a particular topic, sometimes something really broad like science, sometimes more specific, climate, energy, even aviation. The audience for these publications is much narrower and often has a higher level of understanding of the particular topic than the general public might. They're self-selecting for people who are already interested in the subject. So this type of publication might have room for more technical content than a local newspaper would. So these outlets may cover the same new piece of research in very different ways. National outlets might highlight its broad applicability across many regions, while a local outlet might tie it to local scientists or organizations or local events. And a specialty outlet might cover the research technique that's of interest to a science-savvy audience, but not the general public. But before you start tailoring a message, a journalist needs to reach out to you. And to do that, they need to be able to find you. If you are interested in speaking to the media, you need to have a website. You can use a departmental or lab website if you have the flexibility to add the information that journalists are looking for. Otherwise, you might want to look into creating your own using something like Weebly or Squarespace. You want your website to come up in two different Google searches, a search of your name and a search of the topic you're interested in speaking with the media about. Keep in mind that most of the time that journalists are Googling areas of research, they're not necessarily going to be using the most specific, technically correct words. So you want to make sure that you use non-jargon keywords on your website. You can absolutely use the jargony ones too, but you want to make sure you explain what you do in accessible language so that A, a reporter can understand it, and B, Google will find you when a reporter searches for you. Your website should also contain your contact information, preferably your direct email address and not a contact form, a list of your publications, what projects you're currently working on, links to any previous media appearances, and videos of lectures or presentations, even academically focused ones. Journalists, particularly radio and TV journalists, sometimes want to see how comfortable you are with public speaking before reaching out. You'll also want to consider setting up profiles at Google Scholar and ResearchGate. These aren't as likely to be used by local general assignment reporters, but they definitely help make you more findable by specialty reporters. Your university, and possibly even your department or college, has a press, media, or communications office that can also help you be found. Reach out to your public information officer, media relations specialist, or communication officer, and let them know you're interested in speaking with media, what your specific expertise is, and any experience you have or media training that you've done. If they're contacted by a journalist looking for an expert, you'll be on their radar. Your university's press office can also help you get your work to journalists. PIOs, those public information officers I mentioned, are experts at what science can become a good news story and can work with you to develop and distribute a press release for an upcoming paper. Note that they won't write a press release for just any paper that you have coming out, but if there is something that you think is news or that they think is newsworthy, they can be a really great resource. And if you want to go directly to reporters yourself, social media is great for that. Most reporters are really active on social media, especially Twitter, and actually do a lot of their reporting through those channels. Follow local reporters in your area or reporters who specialize in your field, plus other scientists and experts. If you choose to use social media for this purpose, it's not enough just to follow people, though. You need to engage with the people that you follow. Comment on their stories, comment on their newest paper, get involved in conversations in your area of expertise, but do so thoughtfully. Being reactionary on Twitter may not actually really help your case. On social media, you can cultivate relationships with reporters, demonstrate your expertise and willingness to communicate with the public, and become top of a reporter's mind when they're writing on your subject area. That being said, it is absolutely not a requirement to be on social media to be considered as a source. Once you do get the call, or more likely the email to do an interview, there are some things that you can do to make you an invaluable source to a reporter, while also making sure that you get your message across. The first is to respond to the reporter quickly. Remember that journalists are often publishing a story or even a few a day, and that means that they often have really short deadlines. It's not uncommon to get a request to do an interview in the next couple of hours. That's not because they've procrastinated or because they see their work as more important than your schedule. It's likely that they just got an assignment and have less than half a day to report and write that story. If you say yes early, you're giving yourself more flexibility on scheduling. If you aren't available or say no, the reporter can cross you off the list and move on to trying to find another source. Plus, you'll be remembered as being responsive, and so even if you aren't able to do that interview, the reporter is likely going to be more likely to come back to you in the future. Before the interview, write down 2 to 3 points that you want to make ahead of time. A lot of interviews take place via Zoom or by phone these days, so you can actually have these written down in front of you as you're talking. You also want to prepare the data, evidence, and examples that back up these points. Bring your 3 points up early and often, because these are the things that you want a reporter to leave with if they take nothing else away from your conversation. At the very beginning of the interview, you want to describe the big picture problem. This could be one of your 3 points, hint, hint. Even if you're not explicitly asked about the big picture or challenge, step back and explain it. Say something like, before I answer that question, I want to give you a little bit of background. This will make sure that you and the reporter are on the same page about why this particular subject is important and that you're working from the same framework. And if you find out that you are working from different frameworks and the reporter asks you a question that you disagree with the premise of or is based in a faulty assumption, feel free to say so. Try saying something like, actually, that's not quite right. Let me explain. Or, well, that may be one factor, but the bigger issue here is whatever it is. And if you don't know an answer, it's okay to say that too. Way better than making something up. You could say something like, I'm sorry, that's outside of my area of expertise. Or let me look into that and get back to you. Or I can't answer that question, but here's someone else who could. Of course, if you offer to get back to somebody with that information later on, make sure you do actually get back to them and follow up. And if you're not the right person to answer the question, you can make a recommendation either to a specific person or a more general type of expert, something like an environmental engineer would be better able to answer that question. But if you do recommend a specific person, make sure you know ahead of time that they're actually interested in speaking with the media. And now for some quick do's and don'ts. Do use things like analogies, visual examples, and anecdotes to explain concepts. Prep these ahead of time when you're working on your 3 points. Not only can these help the reporter understand what you're saying, but they're often the things that are going to be memorable and get quoted. So using them will actually increase your odds of being quoted in the final piece. Do ask clarifying questions. If you're not sure what a reporter is asking, follow up with your own questions to be sure you understand. And do ask the reporter to summarize what they heard you say or what you took away from an answer. This will give you the chance to make sure you're both on the same page and clear up any misunderstandings before you even leave the interview, increasing the odds that the story is accurate and has the needed context. Don't use acronyms, abbreviations, or jargon. These can be really confusing for both the journalist and their audience, and so they make what you say less usable and quotable. Also, there are studies that show that even if you've defined a piece of jargon or an acronym at the beginning, continuing to use it later on still makes comprehension more difficult. So just defining it isn't necessarily a workaround here. Don't rely on trying to go off the record. The default in reporting is that everything you say to a reporter is on the record, which means that it can be quoted and attributed to you. Anything else must be agreed to ahead of time. Generally speaking, off the record means that what you say cannot be used by the reporter in any way. But again, this must be agreed to ahead of time. If you just say, well, off the record, and then continue speaking, that is not off the record. If you say something and then say, oh, that's off the record though, that is not off the record. We suggest that you don't rely on trying to go off the record if you don't want to be quoted on a topic. Just say you're not prepared to talk about that subject and leave it at that. And finally, don't go into an interview blind. Ask your own questions about the outlet, the audience, the journalist's familiarity with the topic, the format and length of the interview. That will help you target the points as you prepare to ensure that you're giving the reporter exactly what they need while also getting your message across. So, with that, I'm going to turn this section over to Rick to introduce today's panelists and open up the floor to your questions. We'll have potentially some questions coming in from those of you in the room and also those of you at home. So just kind of be patient as we try to get to all of you and kind of switch back and forth.
There we go. Thank you, Tori, for that fantastic introductory presentation. And welcome everyone to part 2 of today's session. The first thing I want to do is introduce myself and our panelists for today, and we'll get started with opening things up to Q&A. I'm Rick Weiss. I'm the director of SciLine. My background is primarily in journalism, 15 years as a Washington Post science reporter and some time at other kinds of publications, and now overseeing operations at SciLine, which, as Tori mentioned, is all about helping reporters include more evidence-based, scientifically validated information in their news stories, whether those stories are about science per se or are about some other topic where science can really help the case. I want to introduce our 3 panelists who we've brought in today to answer your questions. Uriel Garcia is an immigration reporter with the Texas Tribune. He's based in El Paso. His beat has included coverage of Mexican and Central American immigrants crossing the border into Texas, including their sometimes tragic fates, as well as the mass murder of children and teachers at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, an event that, in combination with other such shootings in this country, has been classified by some as a special kind of human rights violation all its own. Before joining the Tribune, Uriel worked at the Arizona Republic, where he covered police violence and immigration enforcement. We also have Christoph Kettel, who is a visual investigations journalist with the New York Times, who uses imagery analysis and video skills to reveal armed conflict activities and in particular human rights violations, including evidence of mass graves in Ukraine and Mali and other places. His work spans the gap really between scientists like some of you in the audience who are generating human rights related data streams and those seeking knowledge about or justice for the victims of such heinous acts. He was also part of a team that won this year's Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for coverage of the civilian toll of US air and drone strikes. And then third, we have Victoria St. Martin, who now at Inside Climate News. She's an environmental justice reporter who has brought to her beat a blend of really interesting personal life experience and journalistic chops that she developed at a number of influential newsrooms, including the Washington Post and the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Newark Star-Ledger, to cover the inequitable burden of health risks that are shouldered by under-resourced and less politically powerful populations, with a particular focus on healthcare disparities affecting Black women. So a really great panel today to talk about the intersection between journalism and scientific work relating to human rights. And just to get things started, I'd like to take the prerogative as the moderator here and ask our panelists to answer one or two questions to get started. And the first one I want to go through for each of you, just for context, is if you could each begin by telling us a little bit about your backgrounds, how you got into journalism generally, and how you landed on the particular beat that you're on. I know that I got into journalism kind of late in life, and I never, expected to be doing the kinds of stories and the kind of coverage I ended up doing, even though I loved it when I got there. So I'm curious, was this a life calling for you from childhood, a stroke of opportunity, or some other impetus that got you there into journalism and onto this beat? Uriel, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you. The way I got into journalism is I started taking community college classes, and I took a journalism class as an elective. The class was being taught by a former Arizona Republic editor who really just encouraged me to continue with journalism. It wasn't a passion or anything. It was just sort of I need a job, and I set myself out as a goal to be a journalist when I graduated college. And it's been working out for the past 10 years.
Great. Christoph, how about you?
Definitely not a life calling. So I also got to it a little bit later in my late 30s. And it started out actually to some degree with AAAS because I started working in 2007 at Amnesty International. And I came right on board when the team I was working for, the crisis response team, partnered up with AAAS, the Geospatial Technology and Human Rights project, as it was called back then, to look into using non-traditional reporting, which at that point was heavily focused on satellite imagery for human rights documentation. And I kind of stuck with that, right? So like I'm still looking at satellite imagery. Like back then, I did not look at it because I worked with the smart folks from AAAS to sort of get their findings and use it in documentation efforts. But I picked up a few skills over the years, and then of course started looking at video and video analysis and video verification for Amnesty International. But that field really grew, and the New York Times started building up a dedicated team that focuses on that specific beat. And that was my way in. So my first journalism job was actually the New York Times, which is quite lucky, I guess.
That is unusual, I must say. Interesting story. Victoria, how about you? How did you end up in this predicament?
I guess I was going to say it was a life calling for me. I know it's funny that you said that. As a little girl, I always was the one who asked why. I asked a lot of questions, and I loved to write. And I always carried around like a little notebook that my grandfather gave me, and I loved reading the New York Times with my dad. And so it was something that I always kind of said, I'm going to be that person who writes those words on the page one day. And then, when I went to college, of course, I joined my school newspaper, and um, I guess I could say the rest is history. I do. One thing I did want to say is when I was diagnosed with breast cancer 11 years ago, and that around that time I decided to go back to school and to get my master's in journalism. And I ended up working at the Washington Post. And that was really where I realized my love for health journalism, and kind of, taking something that this tragedy that happened to me, right, and kind of researching it the way that a journalist would, and being able to tell stories about it, about my experience and about other people's experiences. So yeah.
Hmm. That pretty interesting. Well, it sounds like a majority did not really know what they were getting into over the years. I like myself, so that's encouraging to hear. I, like you, Victoria, though, didn't go to get a master's in journalism until 10 years after my undergraduate, when I was thinking, what should I do next with my life? And people said, you know, the letters you send now and then are really well written. You should be a journalist. So a lot of ways to get into this. And then suddenly here we are burdened with, you know, responsibilities of telling very important stories in influential outlets. So let me ask a question just related to that day-to-day work, and remind people in the audience that if you have a question, you can send it in through the chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'd love to get questions from the audience. But let me ask, in terms of the nuts and bolts of doing your work, just to understand the practicalities, I'm curious, and I think people would like to know how you go about deciding on the stories you're going to write. You know, to what extent are they assigned by editors, or are they responding to outside pitches, maybe from scientists, maybe from PR firms, or are they just the result of your own observations or interests? And maybe there's a mix here, but I think I often hear people asking, why did you do that story, or how did you decide to do that? Uriel, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I think for me, how I decide to do stories is that there's obviously immigration is a big topic, but and Texas Tribune tends to focus on policy inspired stories. But what I try to do specifically is that if there's a very specific immigration policy, what I try to always do is look for a person impacted by that policy. um there are certain weeks where the news cycle just, not necessarily the editor will assign me, but a certain announcement of a policy I have to write. It's what we call breaking news, but I always try to tend to follow up on that breaking news by talking to the migrants themselves, who've been affected by certain policies, talking to shelters, immigrant rights workers, law enforcement when they want to talk. They're not always the easiest to talk to, but for me, I try to write very human-driven stories. I may have a lot of data on certain things, but I don't write stories unless I know that I have a person's story that will drive that story.
Hmm. Not always very happy stories. We can get into that a little bit later. I've been reading some of your more recent stuff, and some of it's quite painful, actually. So it's a tough beat to cover. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Christoph, what's driving your agenda when you're figuring out how to spend your time each day?
I think it's really a mix of sort of like the editors or our managers sort of like pushing us in a certain direction and coming up with your own ideas. I have to say the last 2 years there were a little of my own ideas because it was just the news were just so busy. Then you don't have to worry about that on the one hand, but then of course you like maybe do stories that or maybe you do not stories that you would love to do. But I think maybe to give one example, so I'm in a particular situation that I'm mostly doing more investigative stories. So sort of like pitches about a new report or like a new product or whatever, if people send that to us and there's nothing I can do with that. Or I get a press release that like about something's coming out in 2 days, there's nothing I can do with that. Because as more as of an investigative reporter, like we're not really covering that kind of stuff. But having that said, the way to go about it from sort of like a source perspective is, because I have done that, like people, let's say at think tanks or experts or even scientists, right? They could approach us and have approached me in the past of like, hey, we're looking into doing in a report that might be of interest to you. It might come out in 3-4 months, maybe later. And I can also not just then say like, oh, this is a great topic, and once the report is a little bit better, send it to me, because I have to do my own reporting. So I cannot just do a story about a report. But I did that with a story on North Korea and how oil is smuggled into the country a couple of years ago. And that is really nothing that's a day-to-day news story, right? But somebody like that I have worked with before. I was testing the waters. We did a very short article like 2 years ago already. So I got a feel for them and what kind of source they are, how much knowledge they have. And then they came back to me a few months later, which is exactly what I was hoping for. Is like, hey, we're starting to look into this topic, right? Is this of interest to you? And I'm like, I'm definitely interested. Let me talk to my editors. They were interested in it as well. And we saw very clearly that we can bring our reporting to the table, building on their research, because that's really, really important for us. I cannot just take something over that somebody else did and put it out there. So that's sort of more an example where somebody approached me externally, somebody with expertise who worked at a university. In other cases, I think it's very straightforward, right? Like this year, the directive is, especially at the beginning of the year, like you have to work in Ukraine, which is very logical. It's not really that you have to spell it out. It's very clear for our team to look into that. And for 2 months, I actually was doing the day-to-day coverage because there was so much news. And what that meant was like, yes, you do Ukraine, but the first thing I did in the morning and my colleagues in the morning did is like go on Telegram and look for new videos that come out of Ukraine and like, let's see how the attack on Kiev is unfolding, right? Through like the people who live there and through the videos they film there. In my case, I also went and looked at satellite images, right? And see if there's like certain areas where there's new development coming up, right? And then I pitched that to my managers and they sent it off to the live blog, right? Where we could do a quick story that was very unusual for our team, but it was sort of like a different system. So we do really a lot of different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. I think a lot of people don't appreciate that some of these stories really do take literally months, many months sometimes to pull together a really thorough investigative piece. And I want to circle back a little bit later on the picking up video from Telegram and so on, because I think that raises some interesting questions about attribution and assuredness that what you're looking at is something real, especially these days with the ability to make phony videos getting so good. But maybe we'll loop around to that in a few minutes. Victoria, let me just turn to you though and see sort of what gets you over that hump to jump on a story and choose a particular topic or 2 or 3 at once, whatever is going on that you want to write.
I was going to say much of the same of the other panelists, right? Like it's a little bit of a mix of everything, a little bit of what's assigned from an editor, a little bit of what's pitched from public relations specialists, and then a little bit of enterprise of like things that I find interesting, like almost like a grocery list, right? You have your vegetables, you have, your meat and potatoes, and then like your ice cream. Like, I'd say my enterprise is like my ice cream, my dream stories. But I think just I still have that curiosity that I had when I was 5 years old, writing these, news stories that I wrote. Right. I think that whatever, if I come across something, whether, whether it's I found it on a search engine or on social media, I think it's just something that if it piques my curiosity or I can't stop talking about it to a coworker or a friend or a family member, I'm like, I have to write about this. This is, really interesting. I think I also saw someone mention in the chat or asked in the chat about how of trust, how do you see your role as promoting trust in science in an era in which science can be extensively undermined? I think the one thing that I think about when I look at stories and I'm looking at story ideas and I think about that all the time, right? Like this idea of trust. I like to think of us as journalists. We are, right? There's this great quote about us being the first rough draft of history, right? And I love to just, kind of keep writing stories, right? Keep kind of whittling away at a subject. Keep reporting, keep trying to find things, bringing light to darkness, right? Which is something we talk about a lot, right? And I think, in that, one story a day, right? I try to earn trust one story a day, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate what you say about enterprise stories in particular being the ice cream. And my philosophy used to be just keep generating story ideas, because otherwise someone's going to tell you what to write about. And I'd rather just keep those things, pushing those things upstream than to have someone telling me what to do. Although sometimes, obviously, there's just no question what needs to get done. So there it goes. Tori, I don't know if you can hear me, but if there are questions in the room, I wanted to make sure we had a chance to accommodate some of those. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I don't know if I'm in the wrong mode.
One person who just came in, one question hand raised. So I'm going to get to the microphone question first, and then I'll come to you. So if you could just say your name and then feel free to ask your question.
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. Thanks. Thanks so much for your work. You guys do great work. My question really comes from a response I had to a New York Times, and obviously it's not, Christoph, your work, but a New York Times headline that said pro-life advocates see the recent Supreme Court decision as a matter of human rights. And anybody who is an international human rights lawyer, like I am, knows that international human rights doesn't take a stance on when a fetus becomes a person and fetal rights per se, but takes very explicit stances around the rights of women and girls and people who are pregnant to have access to quality health care, to have access to abortion, and to have legal remedies by the state in cases of rape, incest, and other areas. So I was really upset with the Times for having used human rights in that context, and also became really aware of the fact that it's very hard to get newspapers to use human rights terminology correctly. I often engage with local media, and I'm in the Midwest, so human rights is a very abstract term for them, and they don't really want to engage conceptually on questions around what are human rights. I find obviously civil rights is much more a common terminology, but then newspapers don't do a very good job of, how do civil rights interact with a broader spectrum of human rights in explaining that to the public either. So I'm wondering, from your experience, and I know it's not your job to sort of teach the public about what human rights means per se, and all the work that you do is so clearly human rights related reporting with scientific dimensions. But how do you deal with this issue of, explaining things to the public and linking to broader sort of global issues or global agendas like human rights without alienating the public in terms of access to information, making things human-centered, lived experience, and sort of allowing people a space not to use jargon? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. I've wondered about this as well. Is there a line between human rights in the mind of the journalist and civil rights, or how you view the lens that you're writing through? Does one of you want to start with a response to that?
I mean, I can start, but so it's an interesting question for me, because I have worked in human rights before and then made the switch to journalism. And I'm doing very similar work, but it's completely different, right? Because while I was working for a human rights organization, it was very clear what the goal is of any kind of documentation, which is you demonstrate any type of violation. You want to demonstrate a violation of the law. Now, working as a journalist, that is not what I'm doing. It can be part of it, but I'm covering much broader issues. Now, I happen to work for a team that heavily focuses on stories that are closely connected to human rights. And I think I know what you mean, that like sort of the lines get a little bit blurred very easily, because you normally do not work with people who have a legal background or who have a very strong human rights background. So it can be very easily, at least in internal discussions like these, lines can be very blurred very easily. I mean, the way to work around that, at least, and I only can speak for our team, is we try to be, number one, we have 2 people on the team who come from Amnesty and from Human Rights Watch, so that there's sort of the basis for being a little bit clearer. But what I still do, because I have no legal background, we have our sources who have that kind of background, right? So I interview people, despite me having worked on IHL issues, for example, international humanitarian law issues, for a very long time, and even having taken some classes in this field, I still reach out to legal IHL experts or former staffers at international tribunals, right, who have the expertise and who can walk me through sort of like, here are the issues that you are actually looking at, and you cannot just, you know, interpret every violation as a war crime, which is done very easily, right, in news outlets, like, oh, there's like a civilian died, so it has to be a war crime, right? That's the kind of thing we try to avoid, at least in our team. It's not that straightforward. You have to explain why this specific killing of a civilian actually may amount to a possible war crime. And in order to do that, you have to build the context of that killing, right? Like, what was the military targets in the area? What was the military necessity? What type of weapon was used? So we really try to drill down in our investigative pieces on that level of detail to build a very strong case and to be a little bit clearer around the language. What we also do sometimes, and it doesn't work always in video, you cannot have just an expert talk for 5 minutes in a video because people will turn off. But we do interview experts on camera. For example, I did a story on labor rights or labor rights related issues in Xinjiang in China a couple of years ago during the pandemic, where we, you know, like we had a couple of experts that we put into our video to explain some of the rights issues behind the story as well. So that's sort of like how we try to address these issues, you know, be very specific, consult with experts, maybe put experts on the records, because I, as a journalist, I'm not the expert. I cannot make these claims. That's the kind of thing where we try to be very careful and be very explicit about.
It's interesting. You have quite a few more resources there, of course, at the times, in terms of the people you're talking about who are on call or even there working from backgrounds like Amnesty International. I think people in Uriel's or Victoria's position are probably just out there dangling by themselves, doing what they can, reaching an expert when they can. Uriel or Victoria, do you ever, you know, worry or stress about technical lines between human rights, civil rights, things like that, or is it basically just you tell your story and with the resources you have and figure this is a lay language publication for a general public, and maybe it's just really we're talking about more detail than you might normally have the resources to deal with? Either of you want to address that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and it's something that I've been grappling myself as a journalist, is trying to distinguish what is a human right, because I think, you know, you bring up a headline that upsetted you, and uh, sometimes as a reporter, I don't write the headlines, and I bump heads with editors who do write the headlines and say, you know what, that's not the point of the story, or I feel like you're just trying to catch eyes. And I understand the element of trying to catch eyes, but we have to do it in an accurate way. But I do grapple with that a lot, and when that's why I tend to always, when I write a story, have a human element to it, because I think that I also quote expert sources in my story, even if it's human driven story. But I think the general public reacts more when they're reading about a personal story. When they, as an example, one story that has been staying with me a lot is a 26-year-old Venezuelan immigrant who, with him and his wife, crossed the Darien Gap with their 3-month-old baby. And as someone who grew up in the U.S., for me, I had a hard time understanding that leaving your home country is a right that everyone should have, or a right that everybody, you know, does. They get up and they're seeking a better future. And then I'm contrasting that with the systems, the immigration system that's in the U.S. And the immigration system in the U.S. just does not meet the demands that the rest of the world sometimes needs. And so I think, you know, I walk the fine line between advocacy and you know, as the previous panelist just said, I can't make the claim that this is a human right violation. But what I can do is, at the very least, present this very personable story and tell the reader, look, like this is what the world is, this is the context of why this one immigrant is coming to the US. And I try to run my stories a little more than just the immigration system, but also explain what is going on in Venezuela and the fact that the US isn't the only country receiving so many asylum seekers right now. So yeah, I do walk a fine line between those two concepts. The best thing that I can do for my profession is just present a very personable story, but at the same time quote the expert sources who will put it in context for the reader.
Hmm. I just want to add one angle to this story that I think is relevant to you, Victoria, because I know you've written about parts of the country where populations are exposed to either pollutants or industrial effluents. And that one of those areas that I think you've written about before with the question of the so-called Cancer Alley down in Louisiana. I think EPA, I thought I saw a news feed just today or yesterday that EPA has finally agreed that there's actually basically something criminal basically going on there. I don't know if they're going to classify that as a human rights abuse, but it certainly is something real. And so irrespective of what you're going to call it, the writing that you and others have done on this have started to bring actual government action and attention to a problem. And I wonder if you would like to address that, because it seems like that is the goal, right? Is to actually not just describe the problem, but actually trigger some action.
Absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that. And I moved there. That was like one of my first, real journalism jobs. Away from home, I was covering. I was working in a couple newspapers in my hometown in New Jersey, and then I finally got a job in New Orleans in Cancer Alley, right outside of New Orleans, in 2005, right after Katrina, or 2006, right after Katrina. And and I remember people talking about it then, right? Like talking about how um how they worried about their family members and how they were getting sick, and they worried about the fumes, and they worried about all of these things. And I think it's, when you when you mention what you said about the EPA and everything that's happening now, I think it's just this idea of like to kind of keep whittling away at something, right? We are in 2022 now, um, a long time. But like, I think the one thing that I was thinking about too, even just with the question that was asked, right? I think we don't always get it right, right? Or we don't always make change right away. That's why I do believe it is really a rough draft. But I think, to continue the continued reporting and not just from me, but from others, right, of this can really, really help bring light to something. And I also think if you read a headline or read a story and you don't think that the outlet or the reporter got it right, reach out to them. I think that that's how we all learn. We're all human. I always talk about this whenever I teach journalism classes. I'm like, I'm human first, journalist second, right? When I go to a family and I say, I'm going to write about you, I go as a human being. And in that sense, too, when I'm talking to sources or just even somebody who read my story, I'm like, look, the editor put this, and I'm sorry, how can we make this right? The next time we write about this, how can we, what can we do the next time? It's funny. My dad, I didn't realize until years later that my dad and this editor became friends, and I never knew the backstory behind it. And apparently it was because my dad was one of those angry callers who called and complained about like a story that he had written in New York when my dad was in Brooklyn, and he was like, "Oh, you got it wrong. This is not what our neighborhood looks like. Why don't you come here and I'll show you what our neighborhood's all about?" It was after the fires in Brooklyn in the 70s. And they became friends. And this reporter wrote several stories about my dad and about the neighborhood. And it's so funny when they finally told me that story. And actually, that editor ended up retiring shortly thereafter. But it was one of those things where it's like, oh my gosh, like this is what I do. I didn't even know the backstory, but this is me. This is what I do. Like, you call me, I'm like, okay, can I come? Can I meet you? Can you introduce me to somebody who can talk to me about human rights? I don't really know a lot, but can you teach me? Um, so I think don't be afraid to make that call or to send that email, and educate people, because then it can help us educate others.
Great reminder that journalism really is or should be a two-way street. It may seem like it's just the news coming at you in the audience, but journalists are all ears. I have one question here I see online, Tori, which I'll read out, and then if you have more in the room or elsewhere, I'll turn over to you. But this is a question from Neil Rubin, who says, today, trust in science is a significant concern. The problem is contributed to by many sources, including irresponsible science, disinformation, and the urgency for solutions before they exist. How do you see your roles as journalists here as promoting trust in science in an era in which science can be so extensively undermined? And maybe you don't see your role as contributing to an effort to generate more trust in science. But since each of you will at least occasionally call upon scientist sources to confirm things for you, to back you up, how do you see the issue of trust in science, and does that come into play for you? Anyone want to start on that? Christoph, of the three of you, I think you might have the most direct contact. I'm not sure, but you're dealing with people at Planet Labs, for example, who are running these satellites. As you mentioned, you're not just sort of saying what they say, you're listening to what they tell you, and then you're interpreting according to your own, discriminating wisdom, how to deal with what they're telling you. What do you feel like your responsibility is with regard to these scientists you work with?
Sure. I mean, I have sort of like two general thoughts on that. The one thing is, and you touched on this already, is that there's obviously, once things get hard during reporting, it's very easy to say, and you hear that from other people also in the newsroom, maybe sometimes like, oh, let's ask an expert, right? Let's find an expert and they will explain it. So I think obviously we have to be critical, and not, as a reporter, you have to be critical towards your source. So if this is a scientist or an expert, I cannot just blindly take over everything they tell me, right? And you still want to be, maybe talk to various experts and do your own reporting. That can be difficult if this is a really highly scientific topic that you maybe don't understand, then that gets a little bit hard. So I try to stay away from that. But in terms of satellite imagery specifically, and I think the reason Ukraine, the attack, Russia's attack earlier this year on Ukraine, I think was a good example, because we used a lot of satellite imagery, and a lot of news outlets and journalists suddenly started using satellite images that were sent out by providers. Once we get these images, I was very careful to not that I was like super skeptical or like had any doubts about what the images were showing, but I cannot just use these images and publish them, right? So what do you do with that, right? So in my case, you look maybe at 2 or 3 other providers that maybe scientific providers, like the European Space Agency puts out satellite imagery, other commercial providers that I can look at, and they all show the same thing, right? Or they allow me to maybe establish a much more detailed timeline that somebody else puts out. So, you have to do your own reporting, and you have to be critical. And I think satellite images, that's a good example, because you can sort of like, it's not so much fact checking, but you want to provide more context, and again, be much more detailed in terms of, oh, there's a Russian troop buildup in this area, and it turns out the satellite image you get is from yesterday, and the before image is from 6 months before. So that raises the question for me, so why is this news? Did it happen this week, or did it happen 6 months ago? By looking at other satellite image providers, I can establish this happened in the last 10 days. So again, like sort of like being very cautious about and careful about that, I think that's important. And otherwise, I think generally, and this is maybe not directly to the topic, but maybe a way to also promote science is by almost by bringing an almost scientific approach to the reporting, especially investigative reporting, and being very transparent about that and speaking about that. That can be beneficial, I think, in general. And what I mean by that is, let me not have my thesis and my story already worked out before I even start reporting. So I'm like, oh, Russia did this, and now I try to find the evidence. If I find an expert who tells me something contrary to the evidence, I do not throw out the expert, but maybe I throw out the thesis, right? So that's what I mean with maybe you have a more scientific approach and maybe you adjust your thesis and your thesis is wrong, right? So it's these kind of things to like be very careful about it, be critical, build up good relationships also with scientists and experts that you start trusting, right? And that you understand what they're talking about. These kind of things that I try to do.
Yeah, interesting. I like that approach of using the scientific method almost in your reporting and being true to the evidence. It's indirect support for science and scientists, but it is perhaps getting through at some level. And another thing you mentioned, I just want to echo on because it comes up when we're teaching reporters how to deal with science and scientists in our trainings, which is that you do not want to suspend your natural journalistic skepticism about things just because it's an expert who's telling you this. You really need to bring the same sort of questioning to bear for every source that you have. And it's very difficult when it's a topic you don't really have expertise in yourself. That's the reason you're turning to an expert, is so they can inform you about something, but you don't want to be completely naive in the face of that and think that every scientist is going to tell you the same story or give you the same sort of facts. And the same diligence of getting multiple sources that you would have on a non-science topic, you really want to apply even when you're dealing with science. I don't know if Oriel or Victoria have any thoughts on sort of trust in science and whether there's anything that really crosses your plate ever.
I think in my case, being in Texas, the governor had been putting the blame a little on the spread of COVID on recently arrived immigrants. And Title 42 has, the health emergency order has been used as an immigration tool. I think for me, it's something that I really had to dig in and find doctors and scientists who could explain and put into context to me, are immigrants driving the spread of COVID? And kind of like Christoph said, I suspected what the answer was, but I wanted to play dumb, if you will, and basically present that question that politicians with an agenda were saying. And so I simply called doctors and scientists, hey, like, I'm going to ask you this question, and you may or may not take it the wrong way, but are immigrants driving COVID? And let them explain to me, and the way I would bet, because I don't want to leave that journalistic instinct of even questioning or being a bit skeptical of the source, is, seeing where the source has been published before. Who else have they been talking to as far as like other media outlets? And sometimes journalism is it's a small world, right? So I'd call colleagues in the field and say, hey, what source would you recommend for this story that I'm talking to? So vetting that source that way too. But yes, I mean, even in immigration, I think that there could help in promoting science and scientists.
Great.
So I have two questions in the room that I want to get to before we wrap up.
Two questions. One, you touched on this somewhat. The use of language, it's loaded in our day and age, and what attention do folks put on the words they use, which can have multiple interpretations given on ethnicity and background and personal history. And second, a real challenge is getting a principled exponent of alternative perspectives on public policy, principled conservatives, respected scientists who have different interpretations of evidence. That's a bit of a deficit. NPR is somewhat at risk here, and apparently they're going to now have a special program looking at voices from the Midwest, which may be a way of coding conservatives and so on. So please speak to both of these issues: the use of language and challenges with editors who may be a little bit blind, and then the use of respected and established sources that may have different principled views of scientific developments or policy directions.
So just to repeat, if you guys didn't catch everything, the first question is about language. Kind of the use of a lot of language now is very loaded or has a lot of connotation to it. And how do you think about language? How do you work with your editors around using this language that might have be loaded or have connotations? And then the second question there was about thinking about how to include different perspectives, maybe I believe we had principled conservative views versus principled liberal views, and how you go about making sure that different perspectives are incorporated into your stories.
I was just going to say, I think, kind of this idea of, well, I was going to touch on like making sure that all views are, represented in our stories. I think, that's one of the tenets of journalism, right? Like that we, kind of try and get every folks from every angle to talk about issues, to bring about conversation, right? Like I think part of that idea of, right, that I keep talking about, bringing light to darkness, right? I think part of that, what also comes with that is, right, bringing different perspectives to the table and allowing our readers, viewers to see what the discourse is on something. And I don't know, language, I think the one thing that I think about when I'm writing is kind of that same thing, right? Fairness. Like when I think about bringing both perspectives to the table, I think about being fair, right? And of course, this is being objective, right? This is this is a topic of discourse in the journalism world, being objective. But yeah, I think trying to be as objective as possible, even in the language that I use, and even in the way that I live my life. When I ever talk to students about this, it's like something like even just, right, like not taking a free cup of coffee, right, from a source, right. Just trying to just always be fair and as objective as possible in everything that I do and say and write. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
I think in my case, I think a lot about the use of language a lot, particularly because of the two big topics that I've covered, which was police violence and immigration. I guess as an example in immigration, a lot of news outlets tend to use the term undocumented immigrant or illegal immigrants. And there's sometimes have a problem with even the term undocumented immigrant, because the type of immigrant that we're talking about now they're the type of people who are turning themselves into Border Patrol and have been given documents to stay in the country as their immigration case is pending. And it is something that I bumped heads with editors, and luckily in the newsroom that I'm in, they respect my quote unquote expert opinion a little more. And I've said, I want to stay away from the term undocumented immigrant because unlike immigrants 20, 30 years ago who were entering the country to avoid detection and to live in the country without a social security card number or work permit, is vastly different from the immigrants who are talking about now, who do get a chance to get a work permit and a social security card number. And so for me, it's something that I think about a lot. And I said, look, it's not about necessarily being politically correct, it's about being accurate here. And if we're trying to be accurate, or undocumented immigrant is an outdated term now if we're talking about the type of immigrants we're talking about. Now, as far as the type of sources we're talking about, I think, for me, again, the topic that I'm covering is very heated and everybody has an opinion, whether they know about the subject or not. And so for me, I try to I'm always transparent about who the expert source is. Like, do they work for a liberal think tank, or are they an immigrant rights advocate? And what does that mean? Are they supporting a pathway for citizenship? So I try to be very transparent about the expert source that I'm quoting. And it's sometimes not always about representing all sides, because some sides have a very clear agenda that they just simply don't want immigrants in the country. And I have to be careful if I want to be able to promote that idea. I think there are legitimate opinions about how illegal immigration or unauthorized immigration should be handled. But let's say, for example, I'll give you a very specific example. One of the misconceptions about illegal immigration is that historically, most of the undocumented immigrants living in the country, about half of the undocumented immigrants living in the country actually enter the country legally with a visa and simply overstayed it. But there's a lot of emphasis on we have to secure the border, when a lot of the times they're entering through a port of entry or coming through a plane. So I have to weigh with what I know with whatever the opinion of that expert is.
Great points. And I can just say from personal experience, reading some recent stories of yours, Uriel, I'm thinking of the one about the 22-year-old Mexican guy who came over the border and was just shot, indiscriminately by actually a warden of a nearby detention center because he was identified as an immigrant, maybe an illegal immigrant. Your reporting on that, which stayed away from those kinds of terms, I think made it much easier for a reader like me to feel the sympathy and the harm that was done there, rather than characterizing this person as someone who, maybe didn't belong in this country anyway, because here he is crossing the border illegally. So really, it makes a difference, I think, in how readers hear and read these stories when those terms are used carefully. I know we're just about out of time. Did you want to try to squeeze one more question in, Tori?
We need to wrap up. The next section is here, but we do have a few more questions in the room. So I'm wondering if they could potentially, Rick, maybe email their questions to you, and you can kind of crowdsource some answers, because we have the world's most patient question asker who's been waiting for quite some time to ask the question. So if I can just direct people to you to ask any follow-up questions they may have.
We'll do that. And we'll try to get everyone's questions answered by at least one or two of our panelists. Thank you so much, the three of you, for bringing your own very different but altogether interestingly unified perspectives on the really important task of reporting on these issues. Thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for joining us today. And thanks to the audience for coming and for your questions online and in person.